The gunshot shattered the afternoon silence before Josephine Ellis even realized. She had been running toward the sound instead of away from it, her swollen belly making each step a gamble as she rounded the corner of the Mercantile in Desdemona, Texas. The year was 1883, and the scorching August heat made the dusty streets shimmer like water, but Josephine barely noticed as her eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before her. Two men stood facing each other, guns drawn, while a third lay motionless in the dirt. Her breath caught when she recognized the dead man as Billy Thompson, one of the ranch hands who had worked for her late husband. The other two men she did not know, but their cold eyes and the casual way they held their weapons told her everything she needed to know about their profession. "Please," she heard herself say, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. "Please, there has been enough killing." Both men turned to look at her, and one of them, a lean figure with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold years of hard living, lowered his gun slightly. The other man, broader and with a scar running down his left cheek, kept his weapon trained on the first. "Madam, you should step back," the dark-haired man said, his voice low and steady. "This does not concern you." "It concerns me when men are dying in my town," Josephine replied, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. She was 7 months along, carrying the only piece of her husband she had left after he died 3 months ago in a ranching accident. The baby kicked hard against her palm as if responding to her racing heartbeat. The scarred man laughed, a harsh sound that made Josephine's skin crawl. "Your town. Lady, you best get moving before you get hurt." "James here killed my partner," the dark-haired man said, never taking his eyes off his opponent. "I aim to make him answer for it." "And how many more will die before this ends?" Josephine asked, her voice stronger now despite the trembling in her legs. "How many more widows? How many more children without fathers?" The dark-haired man's jaw tightened, and something flickered across his face, gone too quickly for Josephine to name. Before he could respond, the scarred man made his move, raising his gun toward Josephine instead. The crack of gunfire echoed again, but it was the dark-haired man who had fired, his shot finding its mark in the scarred man's shoulder. The gun fell from nerveless fingers as the man stumbled backward, cursing. "I said this does not concern her," the dark-haired man said coldly. He moved forward, kicking the fallen weapon away before turning to Josephine. "You should not have interfered, madam. That was foolish." "Perhaps," Josephine said, finding herself looking into gray eyes that held more pain than anger. "But I thank you for not letting him shoot me." "Get yourself home," he said, holstering his own gun. "And stay there until the trouble passes." But Josephine found herself rooted to the spot as the man turned to leave, walking past the wounded, scarred man without a second glance. Something about him called to her, something beyond the violence she had just witnessed. "Wait," she called out. "What is your name?" He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Harrison Quinn, madam. Not that it matters much." "It matters to me," she said. "You saved my life." Harrison's expression remained unreadable. "I stopped a man from shooting an unarmed woman. Nothing more." He continued walking, and this time Josephine let him go, though her eyes followed his retreating form until he disappeared around the corner. The town doctor arrived moments later, summoned by the gunshots, and Josephine found herself swept up in the chaos of explanations and questions. The scarred man, whose name she learned was James Coulter, was taken to the doctor's office to have his wound tended before being locked up in the small jail. Billy Thompson's body was carried away, and Josephine was escorted back to her small house on the edge of town by Marshal Hawkins, a gray-haired man who had known her husband well. "Mrs. Ellis, you cannot be putting yourself in danger like that," the marshal said, his voice gruff with concern. Not in your condition. I know, Josephine said quietly, sinking into the chair by her fireplace. The house felt empty without Thomas, too large for one woman and an unborn child. I was not thinking clearly. This Harrison Quinn, the marshal continued, he is a hired gun from what I hear. Came into town 2 days ago looking for Coulter. Seems Coulter and his gang robbed a bank up in Fort Worth and killed Quinn's friend in the process. Quinn has been tracking them ever since. Josephine's hand moved to her belly again, feeling the baby's movements. What will happen to him? To Quinn? Nothing, I suppose. He acted in self-defense and he stopped Coulter from shooting you. Far as I am concerned, he did the town a service. Marshal Hawkins studied her with knowing eyes. Why do you ask? No reason, Josephine said, though the lie felt obvious even to her own ears. I am just grateful he was there. After the marshal left, Josephine tried to settle into her evening routine, but her mind kept returning to Harrison Quinn. She prepared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, ate without tasting, and then sat by the window watching the sun paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and red. The baby was active tonight, pressing against her ribs in a way that was both uncomfortable and reassuring. She talked to the child as she often did, telling stories about Thomas, about how much he had wanted this baby, about how he would have been the best father. 3 days passed before Josephine saw Harrison Quinn again. She was at the general store, purchasing flour and other supplies when he walked in. He looked different in the daylight streaming through the windows, younger than she had initially thought. She guessed he was perhaps 26 or 27, only a few years older than her own 23 years. His face was weathered from time in the sun, but his features were handsome in a rough, unpolished way. Their eyes met across the store, and Josephine saw recognition flicker in his gaze. He nodded politely, touching the brim of his hat, then turned his attention to the storekeeper. Josephine found herself unable to look away, studying the way he moved with careful economy, the way his hand never strayed far from his gun. Everything about him spoke of a man accustomed to danger, yet there was something else there too, something gentler that he tried to hide. "Mrs. Ellis, did you need anything else?" the storekeeper asked, breaking her concentration. "No, thank you, Mr. Peters," Josephine said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks as she realized she had been staring. She gathered her purchases, struggling slightly with the weight of the flour sack. "Allow me," Harrison's voice came from behind her, and before she could protest, he had taken the heavy sack from her arms. "Where are you headed?" "My house, just down the street," Josephine said, surprised by his offer. "But you do not have to." "I know I do not have to," Harrison interrupted gently. "But you should not be carrying heavy loads in your condition." They walked in silence for a few moments, Josephine acutely aware of his presence beside her. Finally, she found her voice. "Are you staying in Desdemona long?" "I had not planned to," Harrison said. "But Coulter is singing about his gang's whereabouts, and the marshal asked me to stick around for a few days in case they come looking for him." "I see," Josephine said, feeling an unexpected disappointment at the thought of him leaving. "That makes sense." They reached her house, and Harrison set the flour sack on her porch. He stood there for a moment, as if uncertain whether to speak, then said, "Madam, I want to apologize for the other day. You should not have witnessed that violence." "You were defending yourself," Josephine said. "And you protected me. There is nothing to apologize for." "Still," Harrison said, his gray eyes meeting hers, "a lady in your situation should not have to see such things." "Your husband, is he away on business?" The question hung in the air between them, and Josephine felt her throat tighten. "My husband died 3 months ago." A horse spooked and threw him. He hit his head on a rock. Something shifted in Harrison's expression, a softening that made him look almost vulnerable. "I am sorry for your loss, madam. That must be difficult, especially now." "It is," Josephine admitted, surprised at how easily the words came. "But I am managing. The baby gives me purpose, something to focus on. You have family nearby, someone to help you." Josephine shook her head. "Thomas's parents passed years ago, and my own family is back east. They wanted me to return to Boston, but this is my home now. I cannot imagine raising my child anywhere else." Harrison's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the horizon. A woman alone, about to have a baby in a town that sees its share of trouble, that is a hard road, Mrs. Ellis. "I am stronger than I look," Josephine said with a small smile. "And please call me Josephine." "Harrison," he offered in return, then seemed to catch himself. "But it would not be proper, given that we barely know each other." "Perhaps we could remedy that," Josephine found herself saying, emboldened by something she could not name. "Would you stay for dinner? It is the least I can do to thank you for your help." Harrison looked startled by the invitation, and for a moment Josephine thought he would refuse, but then he nodded slowly. "I suppose that would be acceptable, though I should warn you I am not much for polite conversation." "I do not require polite conversation," Josephine said, opening her door. "Just honest company." She prepared a simple meal of fried chicken, potatoes, and greens from her small garden, while Harrison sat at her table, watching with an expression she could not quite read. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, broken only by the sounds of cooking and the occasional comment about the weather or the town. When she finally set the plates down, Harrison ate with genuine appreciation, his table manners better than she had expected. "This is the best meal I have had in months," he said after his first few bites. "I have been eating mostly jerky and hardtack on the trail." "How long have you been tracking Coulter?" Josephine asked, genuinely curious. "Near about 2 months," Harrison said, his expression darkening. "He and his gang hit the bank in Fort Worth while I was meeting with an old friend there. Frank, my friend, he was a teller at the bank, tried to protect the customers, and Coulter shot him down like a dog." "I am so sorry," Josephine said softly. "Frank, was he close to you?" "He saved my life once, years back when we were both younger and stupider," Harrison said, staring at his plate. "I owed him everything, and I could not even be there when it mattered." Josephine reached across the table, placing her hand over his. The touch seemed to surprise them both, but neither pulled away. "You cannot blame yourself for that. You could not have known." "Maybe not," Harrison said, his voice rough, "but I can make sure Coulter pays for what he did. And I can try to round up the rest of his gang before they hurt anyone else." They talked long into the evening, the conversation flowing more easily as they grew comfortable with each other. Harrison told her about his life as a hired gun, the places he had been, the things he had seen. He did not glorify the violence or his role in it, speaking instead with a kind of weary resignation. Josephine found herself telling him about her life in Boston, about meeting Thomas when he came east on business, about falling in love with his descriptions of Texas, and deciding to build a life here. "You regret it?" Harrison asked. "Leaving everything behind?" "Not for a moment," Josephine said firmly. "I love Thomas and I love this land. Even now, even with the hardship, I cannot imagine being anywhere else." When Harrison finally rose to leave, the moon was high in the sky. He paused at the door, looking down at Josephine with an expression that made her heart skip. "Thank you for the meal and the company, Mrs. Ellis. I have not had an evening like this in longer than I can remember." "You are welcome any time, Harrison," Josephine said, then hesitated before adding, "I meant what I said, about calling me Josephine." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first real smile she had seen from him. Good night, Josephine. Good night, Harrison. She watched from her window as he walked back toward the boarding house where he was staying, a strange warmth blooming in her chest. She told herself it was simply gratitude, simple appreciation for his kindness, but some part of her knew it was more than that. The baby kicked and she whispered, "What am I doing, little one? Your father has only been gone 3 months." But the baby just kicked again, as if in response, and Josephine found herself smiling despite her confusion. The next morning brought unexpected news. Marshal Hawkins appeared at her door, his expression grave. "Mrs. Ellis, we have received word that Coulter's gang is heading this way. They broke their man out of the jail in the next county over where we transferred him yesterday, and they are likely coming here looking for revenge." Josephine's blood ran cold. "What should I do?" "I am advising all the women and children to stay indoors until this is settled," the marshal said. "Harrison Quinn has offered to help defend the town. He says he knows how these men operate. Is it that serious?" Josephine asked, her hand moving protectively to her belly. "Could be," the marshal admitted. "Coulter's gang has a reputation for being ruthless. We are preparing for the worst." After the marshal left, Josephine tried to go about her day, but fear gnawed at her. She thought of the baby, of bringing a child into a world where such violence was commonplace. She thought of Harrison, preparing to face men who would not hesitate to kill him. The thought of him being hurt, or worse, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. That evening, as the sun began to set, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Harrison standing there, his expression serious. "Josephine, I need to talk to you." She let him in, noting the way his eyes scanned her small house as if memorizing details. "The marshal told me about the gang," she said. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Harrison said, though the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. "But I am worried about you. Your house is on the edge of town, which makes it vulnerable. If shooting starts, I want you to stay low and away from the windows." "I will," Josephine promised. "But Harrison, why are you doing this? You could leave, avoid the trouble entirely." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "I could," he finally said. "But I would not feel right leaving you here alone, knowing what might be coming." "Me?" Josephine's voice was barely above a whisper. Harrison met her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Yes, you. I know we barely know each other, and I know you are grieving your husband. But Josephine, I cannot shake the feeling that I am meant to be here to keep you safe." "Harrison," Josephine began, but he held up a hand. "You do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I am not asking for anything from you. I just need you to know that while I am here, I will do everything in my power to protect you and your baby." Josephine felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his words. "Why? Why would you do that for me?" Harrison reached out, his rough hand gently cupping her cheek. "Because in one evening, you showed me more kindness than I have known in years. Because you looked at me like I was more than just a gun for hire. Because when I look at you, I see something worth protecting, something good in a world that has shown me mostly darkness." Before she could think better of it, Josephine leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "I am scared," she whispered. "Not just of the gang, but of what I am feeling. It has only been 3 months since Thomas died, and I should not be feeling this way about anyone, let alone someone I just met." "Grief does not follow rules," Harrison said softly. "And neither does caring for someone. I am not asking you to forget your husband or to rush into anything. I am just asking you to let me be here for you, for however long you need me." Josephine opened her eyes, looking up at him. "What if I need you to stay?" Harrison's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "Then I will stay." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until Harrison stepped back, his hand falling to his side. I should go. I need to meet with the marshal and the other men to plan our defense. Promise me you will stay inside tomorrow, no matter what you hear. I promise, Josephine said, though the thought of hiding while others fought made her feel helpless. If something happens to me, Harrison began, but Josephine cut him off. Do not talk like that, you will be fine, you have to be. Harrison gave her that small smile again. I will do my best. But if something does happen, I want you to know that meeting you has reminded me what I have been fighting for all these years. Not just revenge or justice, but the hope that good people like you can live without fear. After he left, Josephine sat by her fireplace, her hands resting on her belly. The baby was quiet now, as if sensing her turmoil. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared, the life they had planned. She still loved him, would always love him, but she could not deny the connection she felt with Harrison. It was different from what she had felt with Thomas, more intense, more immediate. Perhaps it was the circumstances, the danger and uncertainty, but it felt real nonetheless. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in bed, listening to every sound, jumping at every creak of the house settling. When dawn finally broke, she rose and dressed, then waited. The town was eerily quiet, the usual morning sounds of commerce and activity absent. She imagined the other women were doing the same as her, waiting and worrying. Around mid-morning, the sound of gunfire shattered the silence. Josephine's heart leaped into her throat, and she dropped to the floor as Harrison had instructed, crawling to stay below the windows. The shooting seemed to go on forever, punctuated by shouts and the thunder of horses. She pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face, praying for it to stop, praying that Harrison was safe. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the gunfire ceased. The silence that followed was somehow worse, heavy with unknown outcomes. Josephine waited, hardly daring to breathe until she heard footsteps on her porch. Fear gripped her until she heard Harrison's voice calling, "Josephine, are you all right?" She scrambled to her feet, yanking open the door. Harrison stood there, covered in dust and with a graze on his left arm that was bleeding through his shirt, but alive. Without thinking, Josephine threw her arms around him, feeling his surprise before his arms came up to hold her. "I am all right," he murmured into her hair. "It is over. We got them all." "You are hurt," Josephine said, pulling back to look at his arm. "Just a scratch," Harrison assured her, though she could see him wince when he moved it. "Nothing serious." "Come inside," Josephine insisted. "Let me tend to it." She made him sit while she gathered water and clean cloth, then carefully cleaned the wound. It was indeed not serious, the bullet having merely grazed the skin, but she bandaged it carefully nonetheless. Harrison watched her work, his gray eyes following her every movement. "You have gentle hands," he said quietly. "My mother was a nurse," Josephine replied. "She taught me basic care before I married. Your husband was a lucky man." Josephine's hands stilled and she looked up at Harrison. "He was a good man and I loved him. But Harrison, I need you to understand something. What I feel for you, it does not diminish what Thomas and I had. It is just different." "You do not need to explain," Harrison said, covering her hands with his own. "I understand, and I am not asking you to forget him or to rush into anything." "But you are asking for something," Josephine said, searching his face. "What do you want from me, Harrison?" He was quiet for a long moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I want the chance to know you better. I want to be here for you when the baby comes. I want to see if what we both feel could grow into something lasting, but only if that is what you want too." Josephine felt the baby kick, strong and insistent, and she placed Harrison's hand on her belly. "Feel that. The baby is active today. Harrison's eyes widened as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "That is incredible," he breathed. "How does it feel?" "Uncomfortable sometimes," Josephine admitted with a small laugh, "but also wonderful, like I am carrying a miracle." "When is the baby due?" "The doctor says another 2 months, maybe a bit less. Early October if all goes well." Harrison's hand remained on her belly, gentle and reverent. "I would like to be here for that if you will let me. I would like to help you to make sure you and the baby are safe." "As a hired gun?" Josephine asked, though she already knew the answer. "As a man who cares about you," Harrison said simply. "I know my reputation, I know what I have been. But Josephine, you make me want to be more than that. You make me want to be the kind of man who could have a real life, a real home." Josephine felt her heart swell at his words. "Then stay. Help me prepare for the baby. Let us see where this leads." Harrison leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "I swear to you I will guard you until this baby comes safely into the world. Nothing will harm you or your child while I draw breath. And after," Josephine whispered, "after, if you will have me, I would like to stay and see what kind of life we could build together." They remained like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, Harrison's hand still on her belly feeling the baby's movements. It was intimate and tender, and Josephine felt something inside her shift and settle, as if pieces she had not realized were scattered were finally coming together. Over the following weeks, Harrison proved true to his word. He took a room at the boarding house but spent most of his days helping Josephine prepare for the baby. He repaired the fence around her small property, fixed a leak in her roof, and chopped enough wood to last through the winter. In the evenings, they would sit together, talking about everything and nothing, growing comfortable in each other's presence. The town gossips had plenty to say about the widow Ellis and the hired gun, but Josephine found she did not care. Harrison treated her with a respect and tenderness that silenced most criticism. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, content to simply be near her. One evening in late September, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Josephine felt a sharp pain in her lower back. She gasped, and Harrison was immediately alert. "What is wrong?" "Is it the baby?" "I do not know," Josephine said, trying to breathe through the pain. "It might be. The doctor said it could come early." Harrison's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "I will get the doctor. Do not move." He returned within minutes with Dr. Matthews, a kindly older man who had been practicing medicine in Desdemona for 20 years. After a quick examination, the doctor confirmed that Josephine was indeed in labor. "It is early, but not dangerously so," Dr. Matthews said. "The baby should be fine." "But Mrs. Ellis, you are in for a long night. Labor with a first child often takes many hours." Harrison looked stricken. "Can I do anything to help?" "Just keep her comfortable and calm," the doctor said. "I will stay, of course, but these things take time." What followed were the longest hours of Harrison's life. He sat with Josephine, holding her hand through the contractions, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, murmuring words of encouragement. As the night wore on and the pain intensified, Josephine gripped his hand so hard he thought she might break bones, but he never complained. "I cannot do this," she gasped at one point, tears streaming down her face. "It hurts too much." "Yes, you can," Harrison said firmly, leaning close. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met, Josephine Ellis. You can do this. Stay with me," she pleaded. "Do not leave me." "I am not going anywhere," Harrison promised. "I am right here, and I will be here for as long as you need me." As dawn broke on September 28th, Josephine's labor reached its final stages. The doctor positioned himself at the foot of the bed while Harrison remained at her side, his hand clasped in hers. With a final tremendous effort and a cry that tore at Harrison's heart, Josephine pushed her baby into the world, For a terrifying moment, there was silence. Then a thin, warbling cry filled the room, and Harrison felt tears stream down his face as Dr. Matthews held up a tiny, red-faced infant. "It is a boy," the doctor announced with a smile. "A healthy, strong boy." Josephine sobbed with relief and joy as the doctor cleaned and wrapped the baby before placing him in her arms. Harrison looked down at the tiny face, the little fists waving in the air, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. This child was not his by blood, but in that moment, he knew he would love and protect this boy as fiercely as if he were. "He is perfect," Josephine whispered, her exhausted face glowing with happiness. "Harrison, look at him." "I am looking," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "He is beautiful, just like his mother." Josephine looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "Would you like to hold him?" Harrison's hands shook as he carefully took the baby, cradling the tiny weight against his chest. The boy's eyes opened, unfocused but searching, and Harrison felt his heart expand in a way he had never experienced. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to the world, Doctor." Matthews smiled at the scene before quietly excusing himself. "I will check back in a few hours. Get some rest, Mrs. Ellis. You have earned it." After the doctor left, Harrison carefully placed the baby back in Josephine's arms, then sat on the edge of the bed. "Have you thought of a name?" "Thomas," Josephine said softly. "After his father, Thomas James Ellis." "That is a good, strong name," Harrison said, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. Little Thomas grasped it instinctively, and Harrison felt himself fall even deeper into love with this small family. "Thank you for being here," Josephine said, her eyes already drooping with exhaustion. "I could not have done this without you." "You could have," Harrison said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But I am glad you did not have to. Now rest. I will watch over you both." Josephine drifted off to sleep. The baby nestled in her arms, and Harrison sat vigil beside them. He thought about the vow he had made, to guard Josephine until the baby came. Technically, his obligation was fulfilled. He could leave now, return to his life as a hired gun, drift from town to town as he always had. But looking at Josephine's peaceful face and the tiny miracle she held, Harrison knew with absolute certainty that he was not going anywhere. The days that followed were a blur of new experiences. Harrison had never been around a baby before, and he found himself learning alongside Josephine. He learned how to change cloth diapers, though his first few attempts were disasters that had Josephine laughing despite her exhaustion. He learned how to burp the baby, how to rock him when he cried, how to tell the difference between a hungry cry and a tired one. More than that, he learned what it meant to be part of a family. He brought Josephine meals and made sure she ate, knowing she often forgot to care for herself while caring for the baby. He did the washing and the cleaning, tasks he had never imagined himself doing, but doing them felt right when it meant Josephine could rest. One evening, 2 weeks after Thomas was born, Harrison was rocking the baby while Josephine prepared dinner. The child had been fussy all day, but he seemed to settle in Harrison's arms, his tiny head resting against Harrison's chest. Josephine looked over and smiled, a sight that made Harrison's heart skip. "You are good with him," she said. "Better than I expected." "He is easy to love," Harrison replied, looking down at the sleeping infant. "Both of you are." Josephine set down the spoon she had been stirring with and walked over to them. She stood close, looking down at her son in Harrison's arms and then up at Harrison himself. "I love you," she said quietly. "I know it might be too soon. I know people will judge, but Harrison, I love you. Not because you helped me, not because you stayed when I needed you, but because of who you are. Because you are kind and strong and gentle. Because you make me feel safe and cherished. Because when I look at you holding my son, I see the future I want to build." Harrison felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I love you too, Josephine. I have loved you since that first dinner, maybe even since the moment I saw you step into the street to stop that gunfight. I know I am not the man your husband was. I know I have a past that is not pretty, but I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life being the man you and Thomas deserve." Josephine reached up, cupping his face with her hand. "You are already that man. You became that man the moment you chose to stay." They kissed then, gentle and sweet, mindful of the baby between them. It was a promise and a beginning, an acknowledgement of everything they had been through and everything they hoped to build. As October gave way to November, Harrison took a job as a deputy with Marshal Hawkins. It was steady work, legal work, and it allowed him to put down roots in Desdemona. He moved out of the boarding house and into Josephine's home, sleeping on the sofa until enough time had passed for propriety's sake. The town, which had initially been skeptical of their relationship, gradually came to accept them. It helped that Harrison proved himself to be a fair and capable lawman, and that Josephine was clearly happy for the first time since Thomas Sr.'s death. The widow Henshaw, who ran the boarding house and was the town's most notorious gossip, even went so far as to say that it was good to see Mrs. Ellis smiling again. One cold December evening, as snow began to fall in soft flakes that were rare for Texas, Harrison sat by the fireplace with young Thomas in his arms while Josephine darned socks. The domestic scene would have been unimaginable to him 6 months ago, but now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Josephine," he said, his voice serious enough that she looked up from her work. "I know we have talked about the future, but I need to ask you something properly." He stood, carefully placing the sleeping baby in his cradle before turning to Josephine. Then, to her surprise, he knelt on one knee and pulled a small box from his pocket. "I do not have much to offer you," Harrison began. "Just a deputy's salary and a past I am not proud of. But I can offer you my heart, my loyalty, and my promise to love you and Thomas for as long as I live. Josephine Ellis, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. It was not flashy or expensive, but it was honest and real, like everything between them. Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Harrison, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms. They kissed deeply, and Josephine felt complete in a way she had not thought possible again. She had loved Thomas, her first husband, and she would always carry him in her heart. But Harrison had shown her that it was possible to love again, differently but no less deeply. They were married in February of 1884, in a small ceremony at the church with most of the town in attendance. Josephine wore a simple blue dress, and Harrison had bought a new suit for the occasion. 4-month-old Thomas was passed between various ladies during the ceremony, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the baby let out a squall that had everyone laughing. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Harrison's life. He watched Thomas grow from an infant to a chubby, smiling baby who reached for him when he came home each evening. He learned the rhythms of married life, the small intimacies and shared responsibilities. He and Josephine would lie awake at night, talking about their dreams and plans, and Harrison found himself thinking about a future beyond the next day or the next job. In May, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again. The news filled Harrison with a joy he had not anticipated, mixed with the fear of something going wrong. But Josephine assured him that everything felt right, that this pregnancy was progressing well. "Are you happy?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas play with wooden blocks Harrison had carved for him. Happier than I have any right to be, Harrison admitted. Sometimes I wake up and cannot believe this is my life. That I have you, that I have him, that there is another baby coming. It feels like a dream. It is real, Josephine said, taking his hand and placing it on her belly, which was just beginning to show. This is your life, Harrison Quinn, our life, and it is just beginning. True to her word, Josephine's second pregnancy progressed smoothly. Harrison hovered and worried, but she handled it with the same grace and strength she brought to everything. Young Thomas, now over a year old, was walking and getting into everything, keeping them both busy. In January of 1885, on a frigid morning that had ice forming on the windows, Josephine went into labor again. This time Harrison was less panicked, though no less concerned. Dr. Matthews arrived quickly, and the labor, while still difficult, was shorter than the first. At noon, Harrison's daughter was born. She had Josephine's delicate features and a head of dark hair, and when she opened her eyes for the first time, they were the same gray as Harrison's. He held her with trembling hands, overcome with emotion. "She is ours," he whispered to Josephine, who was exhausted but beaming. "Really ours, she is," Josephine confirmed. "What should we name her?" Harrison thought for a moment. "What about Hannah, after my mother? She died when I was young, but she was a good woman, kind and strong." "Hannah Quinn," Josephine said, testing the name. "I love it. Hannah Grace Quinn." Little Thomas, confused by the commotion and the new baby, needed constant reassurance that he was still loved. Harrison made sure to spend time with his son, explaining that he now had a baby sister to protect and help care for. The boy seemed to accept this, though he was clearly unsure about the tiny, crying creature that now commanded so much attention. As Hannah grew, the family settled into a new rhythm. Harrison took on additional responsibilities as deputy, and there was talk of him becoming marshal when Hawkins retired. He and Josephine had purchased a larger house on the good side of town, with enough room for their growing family and a yard where the children could play. Young Thomas, now 2, had taken to following Harrison everywhere, mimicking his walk and trying to wear his hat. Harrison would scoop the boy up onto his shoulders and carry him around, telling him stories about horses and cattle and the wide Texas plains. He never told him about the violence of his past, the men he had killed or the darkness he had lived through. That life felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. On Thomas's 3rd birthday in September of 1886, they held a party in their yard. The whole town seemed to turn out, bringing gifts and food. Harrison stood with Josephine, watching their son run around with the other children, while baby Hannah slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "Can you believe it has been 3 years?" Josephine asked softly. 3 years since he was born, since you first came into our lives." "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Harrison said. "Other times it feels like I have always been here, like I was always meant to be here with you." "You were," Josephine said, leaning against him. "I truly believe that. Everything that happened, all the pain and loss, it led us to each other." Harrison wrapped his arm around his wife and children, feeling a contentment that went bone deep. He thought about the man he had been when he rode into Desdemona, driven by vengeance and anger, with no thought for the future beyond making Coulter pay. That man had been hollow, going through the motions of living without truly being alive. But then he had met Josephine, had seen her courage and strength, had felt something inside him wake up after years of dormancy. He had made a vow to protect her until her baby came, never imagining that he would still be there 3 years later, not as a hired gun, but as a husband and father. That evening, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Harrison and Josephine sat together on their porch swing. The Texas sky was clear, stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds. "What are you thinking about?" Josephine asked, snuggling against his side. About how I swore I would guard you until the baby came, Harrison said. And how I am still here, still guarding you and them, and how I will be here for the rest of my life. The cowboy stayed long after the crying stopped, Josephine said with a smile, referencing something he had told her once about his intention to remain. He did, Harrison confirmed. Because the cowboy fell in love, because he found something worth more than revenge or reputation or anything he had known before. He found a home. They sat in comfortable silence, rocking gently, until Josephine spoke again. Harrison, there is something I need to tell you. He looked down at her, concerned by the serious tone in her voice. What is it? I am pregnant again, she said, a mixture of nervousness and joy in her expression. I wanted to be sure before I told you, but Dr. Matthews confirmed it this morning. Harrison felt his heart expand once more. Another baby. Josephine, that is wonderful. You are happy, she asked. I know 3 children is a lot and money can be tight sometimes. I am thrilled, Harrison assured her, kissing her forehead. Every child is a blessing and I cannot wait to meet this new little one. The pregnancy progressed through the fall and winter, and in May of 1887, Josephine gave birth to another son. They named him Henry, and he had his mother's green eyes and a lusty cry that suggested a strong personality. Thomas, now almost 4, was delighted to have a baby brother, declaring that he would teach Henry everything he knew. The years rolled on, marked by milestones and memories. Thomas started school, proving to be a bright student who loved reading. Hannah grew into a spirited little girl who had her father wrapped around her finger. Henry was the adventurous one, always climbing things and giving his mother heart attacks with his fearlessness. Harrison gave up being a deputy when Marshal Hawkins retired, but instead of taking the marshal position, he opened a small ranch on land he and Josephine had been saving to buy. It was modest compared to some of the big spreads, but it was theirs, and it provided a good living. He taught Thomas and Henry to ride, to rope, to care for the cattle and horses. Hannah preferred helping her mother in the garden and with the cooking, though she could ride as well as her brothers when she wanted to. In 1890, Josephine gave birth to their 4th child, another girl they named Hope. The name felt appropriate, as she represented the future they were building together, the legacy of love and family they would leave behind. One evening in 1893, Harrison sat on his porch watching the sunset, much as he had done countless times over the past decade. But now he was not alone. Thomas, 10 years old and already showing signs of becoming a fine young man, sat beside him. Hannah, 8, was on his other side, and Henry, 6, was sprawled at his feet playing with a toy horse. Inside, Josephine was putting 3-year-old Hope to bed. Papa, Thomas said, using the name he had called Harrison since he was old enough to talk. Did you always want to be a rancher? Harrison considered the question carefully. No, son. When I was younger, I did not know what I wanted. I drifted from place to place, taking work where I could find it, never thinking about the future. What changed? Hannah asked, her gray eyes so like his own, studying him intently. I met your mother, Harrison said simply. And then I met you, Thomas. And suddenly, I had something worth fighting for, worth building for. Suddenly the future mattered. Tell us the story again, Henry piped up, about how you saved Mama from the bad men. It was a story they had heard many times, though Harrison always edited it to remove the more violent details. He told them about riding into Desdemona, about seeing their brave mother step into danger to try to stop a fight, about how he had known from that moment that she was special. And you stayed to protect her until I was born, Thomas said, reciting the familiar tale. I did, Harrison confirmed. I swore I would guard her until you came safely into the world. But then you arrived, and you were so perfect, so small and helpless, and I knew I could not leave. I had to stay to make sure you grew up safe and strong. And then you fell in love with Mama, Hannah added. I was already in love with her, Harrison corrected gently. But yes, and she was kind enough to love me back, and we got married, and then you came along, and then Henry, and then Hope. And every day I am grateful for the life we have built together. Josephine emerged from the house, having successfully gotten Hope to sleep. She sat on the porch railing, looking at her family with unmistakable love. "Are you telling stories again?" "Just reminding them how lucky I am," Harrison said, reaching out to take her hand. "We are all lucky," Josephine said. "Every one of us." As the children ran off to play before bedtime, Harrison pulled Josephine down to sit beside him. At 42, she was even more beautiful to him than she had been at 23. There were lines around her eyes from laughter and sun, and her hands bore the marks of hard work, but she was his whole world. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Marrying a man with my past?" "Never," Josephine said firmly. "Your past made you who you are, Harrison. It taught you the value of peace and family, and you left that life behind the moment you chose to stay. You are not a hired gun anymore. You have not been for 10 years. You are a husband, a father, a rancher. You are the man I love." "I am the luckiest man alive," Harrison said, pulling her close. "I swore I would guard you until the baby came, and I have spent every day since trying to prove myself worthy of being allowed to stay." "You proved that long ago," Josephine said, kissing him softly. "The day you held Thomas for the first time and I saw tears in your eyes. The day you asked me to marry you. The day you carved a wooden horse for Hannah because she wanted to be like her brothers. Every day you wake up and choose us, you prove it again." They sat together as the stars came out, listening to their children's laughter and the sounds of the cattle settling for the night. It was a simple life, far removed from the violence and uncertainty of Harrison's past. But it was a good life, built on love and trust and the decision to stay when it would have been easier to leave. In 1895, when Thomas was 12, he came to Harrison with questions about his birth father. Harrison had always known this day would come, and he answered honestly. He told Thomas about the first Thomas Ellis, about how he had been a good man who had loved Josephine and would have loved his son. He told him about the accident that had taken his life, and about how Harrison had promised to take care of them both. "You mind?" Thomas asked, his young face serious. "That I call you Papa, even though you are not my real father?" Harrison felt his eyes sting with tears. "Thomas, I have never minded. From the moment I held you when you were hours old, you have been my son in every way that matters. I may not be your father by blood, but I am your father by choice, and that is a bond just as strong." "I am glad you stayed," Thomas said. "I am glad Mama married you. I cannot imagine anyone else being my papa." Harrison hugged his son tightly, overwhelmed with emotion. This boy, who had come into the world before Harrison even knew him, had become one of the greatest joys of his life. And the fact that Thomas claimed him as his father, despite knowing the truth, meant more than Harrison could express. The ranch continued to prosper, and Harrison's reputation grew as a fair dealer and a skilled rancher. Men who had known him in his previous life sometimes passed through and were shocked to see the transformation. Harrison Quinn, the hired gun, the man who had tracked Coulter across 2 states for revenge, was now a respected member of the community. A family man with 4 children and a wife he adored. In 1898, Josephine surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming pregnant again at 38. The pregnancy was harder than the others, and Dr. Matthews, now quite elderly, kept a close watch on her. Harrison worried constantly, but Josephine remained optimistic. In February of 1899, she gave birth to twin boys. The labor was difficult, and there were moments when Harrison feared he would lose her, but she pulled through. The boys were small but healthy, and they named them James and John. 6 children, Josephine said weakly from her bed, exhausted but happy. Harrison, we have 6 children. We do, Harrison said, looking at his newborn sons in wonder. And I love every one of them, and I love you more than words can say. The twins complicated life in wonderful and chaotic ways. Thomas, now 15, helped with the ranch work alongside Harrison. Hannah, 13, took charge of helping with the younger children. Henry, 11, was in charge of the horses. Hope, 8, was everyone's helper, flitting between tasks with inexhaustible energy. As the new century dawned, Harrison found himself reflecting on how far he had come. It had been 17 years since he had ridden into Desdemona, a man consumed by vengeance and grief. 17 years since he had met Josephine and promised to protect her. 17 years since his life had completely changed course. He was 51 now, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his eyes. But he felt more alive than he ever had in his youth. Every morning he woke up next to Josephine. Every meal shared with his children, every sunset watched from his porch, was a gift he had never expected to receive. On a warm evening in May of 1900, the whole family gathered for dinner. The table was crowded with bodies and noise, the twins in high chairs making a mess, Hope chattering about school, Henry describing a horse he wanted to break, Hannah showing her mother a dress pattern she wanted to try, and Thomas discussing ranch business with Harrison. Josephine sat at the other end of the table, her eyes meeting Harrison's across the chaos. In that glance was everything they had built together, all the love and struggle and joy of 17 years. Harrison raised his glass slightly in a silent toast, and Josephine smiled, understanding perfectly. After dinner, after the children were in bed and the house was finally quiet, Harrison and Josephine walked out to their porch. The Texas night was clear and warm, full of the sounds of crickets and distant cattle. They stood together, his arms around her waist, her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember that first night we sat out here?" Josephine asked. "After you carried my flour home from the store." "I remember every detail," Harrison said. "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I had ever met. I remember feeling something I had not felt in years, something like hope." "I was so scared," Josephine admitted. "Scared of what I was feeling, scared of being disloyal to Thomas's memory, scared of letting you in. But I am so glad I did. You have given me a beautiful life, Harrison." "We gave each other a beautiful life," Harrison corrected. "You could have sent me away after young Thomas was born. You could have told me my job was done and I should move on. But you let me stay, you let me love you and him, and that changed everything." Josephine turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I need you to know something. When I asked you to stay all those years ago, it was not just because I needed help. It was because I was already falling in love with you. Because I saw the man you could be, the man you wanted to be, beneath all that hurt and anger. I saw your heart, Harrison, and it was beautiful." Harrison kissed her then, long and deep, pouring 17 years of love into it. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. "I swore I would guard you until the baby came," Harrison said, echoing the vow he had made so long ago. But the cowboy stayed long after the crying stopped. He stayed through 6 babies, through good times and hard times, through every sunrise and sunset. He stayed because he found something worth more than anything else in the world. He found home. And the woman loved him for it, Josephine added. She loved him for staying, for choosing them every day, for being the father her children needed and the husband she dreamed of. She loved him so much that sometimes her heart felt too full to contain it. They stood together under the stars, two people who had found each other in the midst of chaos and violence and had chosen to build something beautiful. The hired gun who had come seeking revenge had instead found redemption. The widow who had been preparing to face motherhood alone had found a partner and a love that would last a lifetime. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, secure in the love of their parents and the stability of the home that had been built for them. Thomas, the boy whose birth had changed everything, who had given Harrison a reason to stay. Hannah, with her father's eyes and her mother's strength. Henry, adventurous and fearless. Hope, sweet and helpful. And the twins, James and John, the newest additions to their growing legacy. This was the life Harrison Quinn had built from the ashes of his old one. This was what happened when a hired gun made a vow to protect a pregnant widow, and then discovered that some promises were meant to last forever. He had come to Desdemona seeking an ending, but instead he had found a beginning. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Thomas grew into a fine young man and eventually took over much of the ranch operations, allowing Harrison to slow down a bit. He married a local girl in 1903, and in 1904, Harrison became a grandfather for the first time when Thomas and his wife had a daughter. Holding his granddaughter, Harrison was transported back to that September night in 1883 when he had first held baby Thomas. The circle of life continued, generations building on what had come before, and Harrison was grateful to be part of it. Hannah married in 1905, and Henry in 1907. Hope showed no interest in settling down yet, preferring to help manage the ranch and care for her younger brothers. The twins, now 8, were inseparable and into everything, reminding Harrison of how much energy young boys had. In 1910, Harrison and Josephine celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 50s now, their hair more gray than not, but their love had only deepened with time. They had weathered droughts and storms, illness and loss, but they had done it together, and that had made all the difference. 26 years, Josephine marveled as they sat on their porch, now a nightly ritual that they both cherished. And it still feels like not enough time. We will have more, Harrison assured her. Many more years, God willing. And they did have more years. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with watching their children build their own lives and families. Years of sitting on that porch, holding hands and remembering how it all began. On a warm September evening in 1920, 37 years after Harrison first rode into Desdemona, he and Josephine sat together in their customary spot. They were both in their 60s now, slowed by age but still sharp in mind and heart. Around them, their family had gathered to celebrate young Thomas's 37th birthday, the same age his mother had been when Harrison had met her. Thomas, now fully gray himself and with children and grandchildren of his own, raised a glass to his parents. "To my mother and father," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, "who showed all of us what true love looks like, who built a family and a legacy from nothing but determination and devotion, who stayed when it would have been easier to leave, and who chose love every single day." The whole family raised their glasses, and Harrison felt Josephine squeeze his hand. He looked at her, seeing the young woman she had been superimposed over the older woman she was now, and he fell in love all over again. "I would do it all again," he whispered to her. "Every moment, every choice, every day. I would choose you in this life 1,000 times over." "And I would choose you," Josephine whispered back. "My hired gun who became my husband, my children's father, my everything. You kept your promise, Harrison." You guarded me until the baby came, and you stayed long after the crying stopped. You stayed forever." "Forever and beyond," Harrison agreed, kissing her hand. "That is my promise to you, Josephine Quinn, forever and beyond." As the party continued around them, as their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren laughed and talked and celebrated, Harrison and Josephine sat together in the peace they had created. The hired gun had found his redemption. The widow had found her second chance at love. And together they had built something that would outlast them both. The story that had begun with gunfire and danger had transformed into something beautiful and enduring. Harrison had sworn to guard Josephine until the baby came, and he had kept that vow. But more than that, he had stayed. Through joy and sorrow, through easy times and hard, through the raising of 6 children and the welcoming of countless grandchildren, he had stayed. Because that was what love meant. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, though there had been plenty of those. Love meant choosing to stay day after day, year after year. It meant building a life together, brick by brick, moment by moment. It meant looking at the person beside you and knowing that there was nowhere else you would rather be. Harrison Quinn, once a hired gun with nothing to live for but revenge, had found everything he never knew he needed in a small town in Texas. He had found purpose and family and love that transcended everything that had come before. And as he sat on his porch, his wife's hand in his, surrounded by the legacy they had created together, he knew without doubt that he was the richest man alive. The sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and golds, and Harrison smiled. This was home. This was love. This was the life he had been given when he made a simple vow to protect a pregnant widow, and then discovered that some promises were meant to last forever. In the years that followed, Harrison and Josephine continued to age gracefully together, their love a beacon for their large family. They saw their youngest children, the twins James and John, grow up and start families of their own. They celebrated golden wedding anniversaries and welcomed more great-grandchildren than they could easily count. When Josephine passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1928 at the age of 68, Harrison held her hand as she took her last breath. He had been with her for the most important moments of her life, and she had been the most important part of his. Though his heart broke at her loss, he was grateful for the 45 years they had shared, for every moment from that first meeting to the final goodbye. Harrison lived for 3 more years, cared for by his devoted children, before joining his beloved Josephine in 1931. He was 72 years old, and he passed away sitting on the porch they had shared for so many evenings, looking out over the land they had built together. The story of Harrison Quinn and Josephine Ellis became part of Desdemona's history, a tale told and retold about the hired gun who had come seeking revenge and found love instead, about the widow who had given him a chance when no one else would have, about the vow to protect that had turned into a lifetime of devotion. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren carried on their legacy, running the ranch and living by the values Harrison and Josephine had instilled in them. The house where they had raised their family became a gathering place for generations, and the porch where they had spent countless evenings remained a place of peace and reflection. And if you were to visit Desdemona, Texas even now, you might hear the story of how a hired gun swore to guard a woman until her baby came, and how the cowboy stayed long after the crying stopped. How he stayed for love, for family, for the chance to be more than what he had been. How 2 broken people found each other in the chaos and built something beautiful that would outlast them both. It was a story of second chances and redemption, of choosing love over fear, of staying when it would have been easier to leave. It was the story of Harrison and Josephine, and it was a story that would never be forgotten.